The smell of smoke came first, thick and acrid, filling his lungs. Then came the clang of a fire bell, a desperate, frantic rhythm that echoed the beat of his own heart. Elias awoke with a strangled cry, bolting upright in bed. The sheets were tangled around his legs, his body slick with a cold sweat, his throat raw from a scream that died before it could escape. He sat on the edge of the bed, his head in his hands, trying to breathe. The cabin was dark and silent, but the ghosts of the fire still danced in the corners of his vision. This was his penance, the price for being the one who walked out when others could not. The crushing weight of guilt pressed down on him, and in that moment he felt utterly, completely alone. It was then that a sound from the corner cut through the ringing in his ears. A soft scrape of a claw on the wooden floor. Elias lifted his head. Through the gloom, he saw a large, dark shape begin to move. It was Shadow, the dog he had rescued 3 days ago, slowly and painfully, limping. The dog crossed the patch of moonlight and stopped beside Elias's bed. Then, with a gentleness that seemed impossible for such a huge creature, he rested his heavy head on Elias's knee. The contact was electric, a sudden, solid warmth that was both startling and deeply comforting. It was a simple, trusting gesture, an offering of presence in the face of an unseen pain. Elias froze. It had been years since he had felt a touch that asked for nothing in return. He looked down. 2 dark, amber eyes looked up at him, and for the first time, there was no fear in them. Only a quiet, patient understanding. A look that said, without a single sound, "I am here. You are not alone." The rescuer, in that moment, was the one being rescued. Elias Vance moved through the dim cabin like a ghost. Outside, the autumn rain was a constant drumming on the tin roof, a sound that matched the dull ache inside his own chest. He chopped wood, stacked dishes, and repaired a fence, his hands working mechanically, while his heart stayed perfectly still. He had built a life of quiet routines, a fortress of silence, and he had no intention of letting anything in. The wind moaned through the tall pines, making the old cabin creak. Elias was used to the sounds. He knew the rattle of the loose window pane, the groan of the floorboards, the whisper of the draft under the door. He was a student of this quiet place, vigilant and watchful, even when there was nothing to watch for. It was a habit he couldn't break. He sat at his small wooden table, eating stew from a can. It was warm, but he didn't taste it. Food was just fuel. He stared at the patterns in the wood grain, his mind a calm gray sea. This was his life now. The steady rhythm of tasks, the safety of solitude, the comfort of feeling nothing at all. Suddenly, a brilliant flash of lightning lit the cabin, followed by a crack of thunder so loud it shook the very foundations of the house. Elias didn't flinch. The sounds of a storm were simple, honest. It was the other sounds, the ones that lived only in his memory, the shriek of metal and falling timber that could still make him freeze. And then, as quickly as it began, the deluge stopped. The drumming on the roof ceased, replaced by a profound, dripping silence. The quiet was louder than the storm had been. It felt wrong, unfinished. Driven by an old instinct to assess the damage, Elias pulled on his worn boots and opened the door. The air was cold and smelled of wet earth, pine needles, and ozone. A thick mist clung to the ground, swallowing the familiar shapes of the forest. He stepped onto the porch, his eyes scanning the property. A fallen branch here, a puddle there. Everything seemed to be in its proper place. But it wasn't. Near the woodpile was a heap of darkness, a shape that did not belong. It was too big to be a fallen log, too solid to be a trick of the mist. Elias's posture changed. His exhaustion fell away, replaced by the sharp focus of a man trained to walk into unknown dangers. He moved toward it slowly, his boots making no sound on the damp ground. As he drew closer, the shape resolved itself. It was an animal, a massive one, with fur as dark as a moonless night, matted with mud, and something darker that could only be blood. It was so still, he was sure he was too late. Then he saw it, a faint, shallow rise and fall of its ribs, a puff of steam from its nostrils. The animal was alive. As if sensing his presence, it lifted its heavy head just an inch, and a low, guttural sound of pure pain escaped its throat before it collapsed again. Every instinct for self-preservation screamed at him, "Walk away, go back inside. This is not your problem." This was an anchor that would pull him down, a connection he could not afford, a wound that would ask something of his own. He took a step back, his hand on the door. But in the dim light, he saw the animal's eyes. They were open, and in their depths was a fear so vast and weary it felt ancient. It was the look of something that had run until it could run no more. And in that moment, the ghost in the cabin receded, and the firefighter took his place. The man who ran toward the fire, not away from it. With a final surge of effort, he dragged the heavy, mud-caked animal over the threshold and shut the door. The roar of the storm was instantly muffled, replaced by the sound of dripping water and the dog's ragged breathing. They were alone now in the quiet light of the cabin, two strangers brought together by the storm, one wounded on the outside, one on the inside. The cabin door groaned shut, finally sealing out the storm. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of wet fur, mud, and fear. The massive animal lay on a collection of old blankets, a dark, unmoving shape in the lamplight. Elias worked with the grim focus of a man defusing a bomb, cleaning the wound on the dog's leg with careful, impersonal motions. There was no bond here, no kindness, just a shared, fragile truce against the night. He brought out his old first aid kit, a metal box with a red cross faded by time and smoke. Inside, everything was in its place. Antiseptic wipes, gauze pads, clean rags. His hands moved with an automatic grace, a muscle memory from a life he tried to forget. He was just patching a hole, that's all. He knelt down, the floorboards cold beneath his knees. He gently touched the torn flesh on the dog's hind leg. It was a deep gash, long and ugly. The animal let out a low whine of pain, a deep rumble in its chest, but it didn't move. It seemed to understand, with an intelligence born of pure desperation, that this was help. Elias cleaned the wound with a detached efficiency. He worked methodically, his face a mask of concentration. He was not a veterinarian, but he knew how to stop bleeding, how to prevent infection, how to do what needed to be done until a professional could take over. It was a job, nothing more. The dog watched him the entire time. Its eyes, a deep, dark amber, followed his every movement. There was no anger in its gaze, no threat, only a profound exhaustion, a surrender to whatever fate the creature that had run out of fight. When he was finished, he wrapped the leg in clean bandages. He stood up, his back aching. The cabin felt impossibly small now, filled by the silent presence of this enormous creature. He could hear its breathing, slow and shallow, a constant reminder that he was no longer alone. He knew the wound was too severe for his simple care. He crossed the room to the old rotary phone mounted on the wall. The cord was tangled, the plastic yellowed with age. With a sigh, he picked up the receiver and dialed the number for the town veterinarian. Dr. Tari, heiress. Thorne's voice was calm and steady, a comforting sound in the late hours of the night. Elias explained the situation in short, clipped sentences. "Found a dog," he said. "It's large. Wounded leg." He offered no story, no emotion, just the facts. The vet didn't press for details. He asked a few simple questions. Is the bleeding controlled? Is it calm? Elias's answers were blunt. Yes. For now. Dr. Soul. Eris seemed to hear the words Elias wasn't saying. "All right, son," he said gently. "Keep him warm. I'll be there at first light." Elias hung up the phone. His duty was done. He looked over at the dog, which had finally lowered its head to rest on the blankets. In the warm lamplight, its dark fur seemed to drink the shadows. He decided to call him Shadow. It seemed to fit. He filled a shallow bowl with fresh water and placed it on the floor, close enough for the dog to reach. It was another practical gesture, a necessary task. He made no move to pet him, offered no soft words of comfort. He had given shelter, not sanctuary. Dr. Eris had promised to come at dawn. For now, there was nothing more to do. Elias retreated to his own side of the small cabin, leaving the dog to the darkness and the blankets. He expected to lie awake, but exhaustion took him quickly. When he woke, and the day after that, nothing had changed. The silence between them remained a vast, empty space. For 3 days, they were simply two shapes in a shared space, the dog in the corner and the man at the table. Shadow, as Elias had begun to call him, would not meet his gaze. He ate what was given, but flinched if Elias moved too quickly. The silence between them wasn't peaceful, it was heavy, like the air before a storm, filled with things that could not be spoken. Dr. Eris had come and gone the first morning, his old truck rattling up the drive. He was a man of few words, with kind eyes that saw more than most. He stitched the wound with practiced hands, murmuring quietly to the dog. "You're a strong one," he'd said, looking at Elias, "but he'll need more than stitches to heal." He left behind a bottle of antiseptic and a sense that he understood the true nature. Elias followed the vet's instructions perfectly. Each morning and evening, he would carefully unwrap the bandage, clean the wound, and apply fresh dressing. His movements were gentle but distant, the practiced touch of a caregiver who refused to care too much. Shadow would endure the process with a tense stillness, his body rigid, his amber eyes fixed on some distant point on the far wall, never on the man who was helping him. The nights were the longest. The moon would cast long, skeletal shadows of the pines across the cabin floor. Elias would lie in his bed, awake and listening. He listened to the house settle, to the wind in the trees, and to the soft, steady breathing of the animal in the corner. The sound was a quiet intrusion into his solitude, a constant reminder that his carefully built fortress had been breached. Tonight, sleep was a battlefield. The old nightmare came back in a rush of heat and noise. The smell of smoke, thick and acrid, filled his lungs. The sound of an alarm bell clanged in his ears, a frantic, desperate rhythm that echoed the pounding of his own heart. He woke up with a gasp, sitting bolt upright in bed, the sheets tangled around his legs. His body was slick with a cold sweat, and his throat was raw from a scream that had died before it could escape. He sat on the edge of the bed, his head in his hands, trying to breathe. The cabin was dark and silent, but the ghosts of the fire were still there, dancing in the corners of his vision. This was his penance, the price for being the one who walked out when others did not. The crushing weight of his guilt pressed down on him, and in that moment he felt utterly and completely alone. Then, a sound from the corner cut through the ringing in his ears. It was a soft scrape of a claw on the wooden floor. Elias lifted his head. Through the gloom, he saw a large, dark shape begin to move. Shadow was getting up, a slow and painful process. The dog took one hesitant step, then another, his limp more pronounced in the profound quiet of the night. He made no sound, no whine of pain or plea for attention. He just walked, his movement deliberate and full of purpose. He crossed the moonlit patch on the floor and stopped beside Elias's bed. He stood there for a long moment, his great head at the level of the mattress, his breath a warm puff of air in the cold room. Then, with a gentleness that seemed impossible for a creature so large, he rested his heavy head on Elias's knee. The contact was electric, a sudden, solid warmth that was both startling and deeply comforting. It was a simple, trusting gesture, an offering of presence in the face of an unseen pain. Elias froze, every muscle in his body tensing. It had been years since he had felt a touch that asked warmth from the dog's head, seemed to seep through his jeans, a small point of heat against the cold dread that filled him. It was an anchor, a physical weight holding him firmly in the quiet, dark cabin, pulling him away from the burning memory. He finally let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. He looked down at the massive head resting on his knee. Two dark, amber eyes looked up at him, and for the first time, there was no fear in them. There was only a quiet, patient understanding. It was a look that said, without a single sound, "I am here. You are not alone." The weight of the dog's head on his knee was a strange and powerful anchor, holding him in the quiet of the present moment. Elias slowly, cautiously, rested his hand on Shadow's fur. The dog didn't flinch. They stayed like that for a long time, two broken souls breathing together in the dark. But morning came, as it always does, and with it, the cold, hard reality of an empty cupboard. The last can of beans was empty. Elias looked from the can to the big, dark dog, who watched his every move with anxious eyes. The thought of leaving him alone was impossible, and the thought of taking him into town was worse. But necessity left no choice. He clipped the worn leather leash to Shadow's collar, the simple click echoing in the cabin, like the sound of a lock turning on his quiet, protected world. Shadow was nervous as they walked to the old pickup truck. He stayed close to Elias, his shoulder pressed firmly against the man's leg. The world outside, the immediate clearing of the cabin, was a place of unfamiliar sounds and smells. When Elias turned the key in the ignition, the truck roared to life with a cough and a sputter, and Shadow flinched, his big body trembling for a moment before Elias's calm hand on his back steadied him. The drive into the small town of Pine Ridge was slow. Elias kept his hands tight on the steering wheel, his knuckles white. He was as on edge as the dog beside him. He felt like he was smuggling something precious and fragile across a hostile border. He glanced over at Shadow, who was sitting upright in the passenger seat, his ears twitching as he watched the blur of trees rush by. As they rumbled onto Main Street, everything changed. People strolling along the sidewalk paused. A conversation between two men in front of the post office stopped mid-sentence. All eyes turned to the dusty blue truck and the enormous, wolf-like creature sitting where a person should be. The quiet, friendly atmosphere of the town seemed to hold its breath. Elias parked in front of the general store and killed the engine. The sudden silence was heavy with unspoken questions. He opened his door and swung his legs out. "Stay," he said, His walked around to the other side and opened the passenger door. Shadow hopped down carefully, his bandaged leg a stark reminder of his vulnerability. He immediately pressed himself against Elias's side, a dark shadow seeking shelter. The reaction was immediate and silent. A young mother instinctively pulled her toddler behind her skirt. An old man sitting on a bench slowly lowered his newspaper, his eyes wide over the top of his reading glasses. The town was not hostile, not yet, but it was deeply suspicious. Their quiet, predictable world had been disturbed by this man and his beast. Across the street, Mrs. Street, Gable was sweeping the front porch of her small, tidy house. She looked up, saw them, and her hand flew to her mouth. The straw broom fell from her grasp, clattering loudly on the wooden planks. Without a second glance, she scurried back inside her home. The sound of her deadbolt sliding into place was sharp and decisive, a clear verdict delivered across the street. A familiar coldness settled in Elias's stomach. He had spent years making himself invisible, and now he felt like he was standing under a spotlight. He squared his shoulders and focused on his task. He would not let their fear touch him. He walked toward the general store, his hand resting reassuringly on Shadow's back, a silent promise to the animal that he would protect him. Inside the store, the air was thick with the scent of sawdust and coffee beans. Mr. C. Henderson, the owner, stood behind the counter, polishing a glass jar. He offered Elias a tight, professional smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Elias," he said, his voice carefully neutral. His gaze kept flickering to the door, where Shadow had laid down obediently on the welcome mat, his head on his paws. The transaction was brief and almost silent. Elias gathered what he needed: flour, coffee, beans, and a large bag of dog food. He paid in cash, avoiding Mr. Henderson's questioning eyes. As he turned to leave, he heard a child's voice from one of the aisles. "Mommy, look, a big wolf puppy." A woman's voice immediately hushed the child, and Elias walked out the door without looking back. The walk back to the truck felt 100 miles long. The whispers had started now, quiet but sharp, like the rustle of dry leaves. He could feel dozens of eyes on him, judging the animal at his side. He loaded the groceries into the truck bed, his movements quick and efficient, eager to escape. He felt their eyes on his back as he walked away from the general store. The whispers followed him like a cold wind. He and Shadow were an island, surrounded by a sea of fear. Back at the cabin, the sense of being watched didn't fade. As evening fell, Elias looked to the horizon, where dark, heavy clouds were gathering, promising a different kind of storm. The sky didn't just darken, it bruised. A low rumble vibrated through the floorboards of the cabin, and Elias saw Shadow's ears flatten, saw the tremble start in the dog's powerful shoulders. This wasn't just a storm approaching. It was a memory, a monster from the past, and it was coming for both of them. The wind began to howl, its voice changing from a low moan to a high-pitched shriek that whipped around the corners of the cabin. The first drops of rain didn't fall. They struck, hitting the tin roof with the force of thrown pebbles. Elias secured the latch on the door, his movements economical and calm, but his eyes kept flicking to the dog in the corner. Then came the first real clap of thunder. It was a violent, tearing sound that seemed to rip the sky in two. In an instant, Shadow scrambled to his feet, his body low to the ground. His calm, amber eyes were now wide with a primal terror, his pupils huge and dark. He began to pace frantically, a caged animal looking for an escape that didn't exist. Elias's first instinct, born of years of training, was to take control, to use a firm voice, to physically restrain, to manage the chaos. He took a step toward the panicking dog, his hand outstretched, his mind already forming the commands. Easy now. Settle down. But another, louder crack of thunder shook the world, and Shadow's fear exploded. He lunged for the door, his heavy body thudding against the solid wood. He clawed at the frame, his nails scraping and splintering the old pine. It wasn't aggression, it was pure, unthinking panic. A desperate, blind need to flee the crushing sound that was coming from everywhere at once. In that moment, Elias saw himself. He saw his own terror in the middle of the night, the desperate thrashing against the sheets, the frantic search for an exit from a memory that had no doors. He realized that trying to restrain Shadow would be like trying to hold down a drowning man. Force would only be met with more desperate force. It would not heal the fear. It would only confirm it. So he did the one thing his training never taught him. He surrendered control. He walked to the center of the small room and slowly lowered himself to the floor, leaning his back against the leg of the table. He made himself small, non-threatening. He did not command. He simply existed, a quiet anchor in the heart of the storm. "It's all right," Elias said, his voice barely a murmur, not much louder than the rain. "It's just a sound. It'll pass." He didn't speak to the dog so much as to the space between them, filling it with a low, steady rhythm. "I'm right here. We're all right." Shadow stopped clawing at the door. His panicked breathing was still ragged, but his frantic energy paused. He turned his head, his wide, terrified eyes fixing on the man sitting on the floor. He seemed confused, his animal instincts telling him to run, but this strange, calm presence offered the storm continued to rage, a battle of sound and light. Shadow slowly, cautiously moved away from the door. He didn't come close, but he stopped trying to escape. He paced in a smaller, tighter circle, his gaze repeatedly returning to Elias. He had made a choice to face the terror from within the cabin rather than from without. Slowly, the fury of the storm began to wane. The thunder softened into a distant, grumbling complaint. The relentless drumming of the rain eased into a steady, almost gentle patter. The flashes of lightning became less frequent, pulsing softly against the dark windows. The world outside was exhaling. The storm finally broke just before dawn. The thunder receded, replaced by the gentle sound of rain on the roof. Shadow's trembling slowly subsided, and the great dog collapsed into an exhausted sleep, his body pressed against Elias's leg. In the quiet aftermath, Elias felt a shift inside himself, a crack in the fortress he'd built. He had sat through the storm, not just for the dog, but for himself too. Elias was sanding a piece of wood, the work steady and quiet under his hands. Then a voice, thin and sharp with panic, cut through the afternoon calm. It was Mrs. Gable, his neighbor, her words tumbling over each other in a frantic call for help. Elias froze. He wanted nothing more than to retreat inside, to close the door and pretend he hadn't heard. She stood at the edge of his property, a small, bird-like woman, wringing her hands, her face a mask of distress. "Patches," she cried out, her voice cracking. "Oh, my Patches is stuck. Please, he won't come down." Her pleas were directed not at Elias specifically, but at the world in general. Elias remained on his porch, a statue carved from hesitation. This was exactly the kind of thing he had moved here to avoid. Messy human emotions, neighborly obligations, the expectation of involvement. His silence was a wall, and he had no desire to open the gate. He could just wait until she gave up and went away. But while Elias was lost in his own reluctance, Shadow acted. He rose from his spot on the porch with a quiet grace. His ears were alert, tuned not to the words, but to the pure, uncut frequency of distress in the old woman's voice. He looked at Elias for a brief second, then stepped off the porch and began to walk. He moved with a calm, deliberate purpose, not running, not barking. He walked directly toward the property line where Mrs. Gable stood, his head held high. He stopped just short of her yard, a respectful distance away, and looked from her distraught face up toward the highest branches of a towering pine tree. Elias let out a quiet sigh. He couldn't leave the dog to handle it alone. He put down his sanding block and followed, his boots heavy on the gravel drive. When he reached the property line, he saw it, a tiny ball of orange fur, perched precariously on a high branch. Its terrified Mrs. Gable saw Shadow approaching and took a fearful step back. "No, no, get that thing away from here," she gasped, her fear for her cat momentarily eclipsed by her fear of the giant dog. "He'll frighten him to death." Shadow paid her no mind. He padded silently past her and went directly to the base of the massive pine. There, he sat down with a soft thump, his powerful body a solid, unmoving presence. He tilted his great head back and simply looked up at the cat, his posture one of immense, unwavering patience. He didn't bark or whine or make any move at all. He just waited. The effect was immediate and profound. Mrs. Sound, Gable's frantic energy, seemed to falter in the face of the dog's stillness. His calm was so complete, so contrary to the ravenous beast she had imagined, that it stopped her panic in its tracks. She stared, her mouth slightly agape, as this creature she had feared became an anchor of tranquility. Seeing her confusion, Elias knew it was his turn. The dog had opened a door that he had been unwilling to even approach. He walked back to his shed without a word and returned carrying a long extension ladder. The metallic scrape of its feet on the ground was the only sound. He positioned the ladder against the rough bark of the pine tree. As he began to climb, rung by rung, he was aware of the strange, silent tableau below, an anxious old woman and a giant, watchful dog, united in their vigil. The whole time, Shadow remained at the base of the tree, a silent guardian, his presence a steadying force for everyone involved. Elias reached the cat, spoke to it in a low voice, and easily scooped it into his arms. Mrs. Gable held her cat, stroking its fur and murmuring thanks. But her eyes were on the giant dog, who now sat calmly at Elias's feet. "I was wrong about him," she said, her voice soft with wonder. "He's a guardian." For a moment, a fragile peace settled over the small yard, a feeling of connection Elias had long forgotten. It was a perfect, quiet afternoon, right up until the moment he heard the sound of unfamiliar tires on his drive. It was a sound that didn't belong here. The slow crunch of tires on the long gravel drive. Elias looked up from his porch steps, his hand instinctively resting on Shadow's back. The vehicle wasn't a friendly pickup truck. It was a white van with the town's official seal on the door. And the man who stepped out wore a uniform that promised rules, not mercy. He was young, with a neatly trimmed mustache and a clipboard held firmly in one hand. He moved with the stiff, self-conscious posture of someone who relies on the authority of his uniform. "Elias Vance?" he asked, his voice polite but devoid of warmth. He stopped a careful 10 feet from the porch, his eyes flicking nervously toward Shadow, who had risen to his feet but remained silent. "Officer Miller," he continued, not waiting for a reply. "Town Animal Control. We've received a complaint about an unregistered, potentially dangerous animal on this property." He gestured vaguely with his clipboard toward Shadow. The word dangerous, hung in the air, a cold and ugly accusation. Elias felt a slow burn of anger start in his chest. It was an old, familiar feeling he had worked hard to bury. He said nothing, simply staring at the young officer, his silence a more potent defense than any argument. He could feel Shadow's muscles tensing under his hand, the dog sensing the shift in his own demeanor. Officer Miller seemed unnerved by the silence. He cleared his throat and consulted his clipboard as if the answers were written there. The report describes a large, wolf-like dog. Given the animal's size and unknown history, town ordinance requires a formal assessment to determine if it poses a risk to the community. He looked up, his expression hardening into one of official resolve. What does that mean? Elias's voice was low and gravelly, the first words he had spoken. It means I have to take him in, Officer Miller said, his tone flat and final. He'll be held at the county shelter for a 10-day observation period. A veterinarian will assess his temperament. If he's deemed safe and non-aggressive, you can begin the process of officially adopting him, provided he meets all criteria. Elias knew what a county shelter was like for a dog like Shadow, a place of concrete floors, echoing barks, and the sharp scent of fear. A giant, timid animal with no known history stood little chance. The label, fear, aggressive, would be applied, and the outcome would be inevitable. The 10-day observation was a death sentence delivered on a clipboard. No, Elias said. The word was quiet, but absolute. Officer Miller sighed, a gust of professional exasperation. Mr. Vance, I'm not trying to be difficult, but I have a job to do. The law is the law. An animal of this size, with no tags, no chip, no records, it's a liability. What if it bites someone? What if it attacks Mrs. C, Gable's cat? He spoke as if reading from a manual, his logic neat and tidy, with no room for the messy, unwritten truths of the situation. Elias wanted to shout. He wanted to tell this boy about the storm, about the nightmare, about the quiet, steady presence that had begun to stitch his own fractured soul back together. He wanted to explain that this animal was more of a guardian than a threat, but the words wouldn't come. How could you explain a wordless conversation to a man who only understood official forms? I can see he's injured, Officer Miller said, his voice softening slightly, a calculated attempt at empathy. Look, I don't want to cause a scene. I'll give you some time. You can bring him in yourself. It will be better for him that way, less stressful. He took a form from his clipboard. Elias did not take it. He just stood there, a silent mountain with Shadow, a smaller, darker mountain at his side. He was a man who had wanted only to be left alone, to fade into the background. Now, the world, in the form of this young man with his rules and regulations, was demanding he surrender the one thing that had made his solitude bearable. Officer Miller drove away, leaving behind nothing but a piece of paper and a cloud of dust. The official notice felt heavier than a stone in Elias's hand. 48 hours. The words stared up at him, cold and absolute. He, a man who had asked for nothing from the world, was now being asked to give up the one thing that had started to heal him. The paper sat on the table, a stark white rectangle in the quiet cabin. 48 hours. The words felt like a judgment, a final countdown on the fragile peace Elias had found. He stared out the window, at the trees and the sky, feeling the four walls of his cabin closing in on him. For the first time in a long time, he didn't know what to do, and the silence offered no answers. He paced the length of the small room, his mind racing. He could run. pack a bag, put Shadow in the truck, and just drive. Disappear again, find another quiet corner of the world where rules and neighbors couldn't find him. But he looked at Shadow, who lay on his blankets watching him with worried eyes, and he knew it wasn't a real solution. Shadow was still healing. A life on the run was no life at all. Defeated, he picked up the phone and called the only person he could think of. He drove to Dr. Eris's clinic, a small, welcoming building that smelled of antiseptic and hay. He sat in a worn armchair in the vet's office while Shadow waited patiently in the truck. He explained the situation in his usual clipped manner, laying out the facts like pieces of a broken machine he couldn't fix. Dr. Eris didn't offer easy solutions. He just listened, his head tilted, his fingers steepled under his chin. He nodded slowly, his calm presence a balm on Elias's raw nerves. Rules are made for the animals people see with their eyes, Elias, he said finally, not for the ones they know with their hearts. The problem is, Officer Miller can only see with his eyes. The vet's words offered wisdom, but no hope. Elias drove back to the cabin feeling heavier than before. He felt the hours slipping away. The thought of the shelter, of Shadow in a cage, was a physical pain. He sat on the porch steps, watching the sun begin to dip below the pines, feeling the finality of it all closing in. Meanwhile, in town, a different story was unfolding. Mrs. Gable stood in the small, fluorescent-lit town office. Her head overheard the gossip at the general store, the whispers about the animal control officer going up the hill, and a fierce, unfamiliar protectiveness had risen up in her. She faced a skeptical clerk, a woman who had known her for 20 years as a quiet, nervous widow. "I'm here about the dog," Mrs. Gable announced, her voice trembling but firm. "The big one, with Mr. Pole, Vance." She recounted the story of Patches in the pine tree, her words painting a picture not of a beast, but of a quiet, gentle hero. When Officer Miller returned to the office to file his report, the clerk pointed him toward Mrs. Ashen Gable. He listened politely, his expression unchanging, as she told her story again, this time with even more conviction. "That dog didn't scare my cat," she insisted, poking a finger in the air for emphasis. "He calmed him. He calmed me." Her story, on its own, might have been dismissed as the ramblings of a sentimental old woman. But later that afternoon, Mr. Henderson from the general store stopped by the office to drop off some paperwork. He mentioned how the big dog had waited on the mat, perfectly still, while its owner shopped. "Never seen a dog that well behaved," he mused, "especially one that big." A small chorus was beginning to form, quiet but persistent. The librarian chimed in, recalling how she'd seen the man and his dog walking by the woods, and how the dog seemed more like a shadow than a threat. Each story was small, a single drop of water, but together they began to form a current, pushing back against the cold, hard letter of the law. The phone call from Dr. Eris was brief. "People are talking, Elias," the old vet said, his voice warm. Mrs. Gable went to the town office. "You're not as alone as you think." For the first time in 2 days, Elias felt a small, fragile seed of hope take root. He stepped out onto the porch, breathing in the cool evening air, feeling like he might just be able to fight this. And that's when he smelled it. It started not with a sound, but with a smell. A sharp, bitter scent carried on the evening breeze, the unmistakable smell of burning pine. Elias stood up slowly, his heart beginning to hammer against his ribs. He knew that smell better than his own name, and then he heard it. A distant, rising wail that cut through the twilight and threatened to pull him back into the fire he'd never truly escaped. The siren grew louder, a piercing shriek that clawed at the edges of the quiet woods. The sound hit Elias like a physical blow. The porch under his feet seemed to sway, the trees blurred, and for a terrifying second, he was somewhere else entirely. He was back in the heat and the smoke. The deafening roar of the blaze in his ears, the weight of the gear on his back. The crush rose, his hands clenched into fists, his breath catching in his throat. Shadow, who had been dozing at his feet, was instantly on alert. The siren was a terrifying sound, a close cousin to the thunder that sent him into a blind panic. Elias felt the dog's body tense, a low tremor of fear running through him. He braced himself for the inevitable flight response, for the frantic scrabbling at the door. But it didn't come. Instead of panicking, Shadow did something extraordinary. He turned away from the terrifying sound and pushed his head firmly against Elias's hand. When Elias didn't respond, lost in the prison of his memory, the dog nudged him again, harder this time. A single, insistent press of his cold nose against Elias's skin. The simple, physical touch was a pinprick of light in a suffocating darkness. It pulled Elias a single inch back from the edge. He looked down, his eyes slowly refocusing, and saw the dog looking up at him. Shadow's ears were back, and his body was still tense with fear, but his eyes were clear and focused entirely on him. It was a look of profound, urgent concern. Then the dog did more. He pushed his great head into Elias's chest, leaning his full weight against him. It was the same gesture he had offered during the nightmare, but this time it was different. It wasn't just comfort, it was a call to action. It was as if he was saying, "You anchored me through the storm. Now let me anchor you through this." The unwavering presence of the animal, his solid weight and focused gaze, broke the spell. Elias took a shuddering breath, then another. The siren was still screaming, but it was just a sound again, not a ghost. He looked toward the orange glow that was now visible above the ridgeline, in the direction of Mrs. The Sway, Abel's property. His training, the part of him that was a protector, finally overrode the part of him that was a victim. "Okay," Elias whispered, his hands sinking into Shadow's thick fur. "Okay, boy." He didn't run toward the fire to fight it. That life was over. But he couldn't just stand here and do nothing. Together, man and dog moved off the porch and began to walk, not run, toward their neighbor's home. They found Mrs. Gable in her yard, frantically trying to use a garden hose against the dry brush at the edge of her property, a hopeless effort against the encroaching threat. The fire truck was at the end of her driveway, its lights painting the scene in frantic strobes of red and blue. Officer Miller was there too, helping to direct traffic, his face smudged with soot. Elias took the hose from Mrs. Gable's shaking hands. "Let's get your important things," he said, his voice calm and steady. He led her back toward her house, Shadow walking quietly at his side, a dark, calming presence amidst the flashing. Dog never strayed, his focus entirely on the two humans he had chosen to guard. As the firefighters got the blaze under control, Officer Miller watched from a distance. He didn't see a dangerous beast. He saw a giant dog calmly leaning against a traumatized man, who was, in turn, comforting his elderly neighbor. The rules on his clipboard seemed very small and very simple compared to the complex, unspoken truth he was witnessing. He said nothing, simply got back in his van, leaving Elias and Shadow to face the quiet uncertainty of the coming dawn. The morning came, quiet and clean. The air still held a faint memory of smoke, but the light was clear, and the world felt still. Elias sat on his porch step, a mug of coffee warming his hands. Shadow lay beside him, his head resting on Elias's knee, his breathing deep and even. They weren't waiting for anything anymore. They were simply watching the sun rise on the first day of what came next. The fire on the ridge had been small, contained quickly by the volunteer fire crew. It had been more of a scare than a disaster, leaving behind a blackened patch of undergrowth but sparing the homes. The real change had not been to the landscape, but to the small community that lived within it. The shared crisis had burned away some of the old fear and suspicion, leaving behind the fertile ground of gratitude. Around 9 o'clock, Elias heard the familiar crunch of tires on his gravel drive. He didn't tense up. He simply watched as the white animal control van pulled to a stop. Officer Miller got out, but this time he wasn't holding a clipboard like a shield. He held it loosely at his side. He approached the porch slowly and stopped. "Morning, Vance," he said. His voice was different, stripped of its official, defensive tone. "Just wanted to let you know the fire chief said you were a big help last night. Mrs. Gable, too. She's been telling anyone who will listen that her 2 guardians saved the day." He offered a small, hesitant smile. Elias nodded, taking a sip of his coffee. He waited, letting the silence stretch. Shadow lifted his head, looked at the officer, and then, satisfied, rested his head back on Elias's knee. Officer Miller cleared his throat. "I've been reviewing the town ordinances," he said, finally looking at the clipboard in his hand. "There's a provision, not used very often, for animals of special community value. It's a bit of a gray area, but after last night, I think we can make a case." He looked up from the paper, his eyes meeting Elias's directly for the first time. "I'm tearing up the order." Elias felt a slow, profound release of a tension he hadn't even realized he was holding. It was like setting down a heavy pack he'd been carrying for years. He couldn't find the words to say thank you, so he just gave another small, "Still need to get him licensed," Officer Miller added, his professionalism returning, but softer this time, "and a proper rabies tag. Dr. Top, Eris can help you with all the paperwork." He paused, looking at the massive, peaceful dog. "He's a good animal, Mr. Vance. You're lucky to have found him." With that, he turned, walked back to his van, and drove away. Later that afternoon, another visitor arrived. Mrs. Gable walked up the drive, carrying a freshly baked apple pie. She set it on the porch rail and fussed over Shadow, scratching him behind the ears in a way that made his leg thump against the wooden planks. "I brought this for my 2 heroes," she said, beaming. She didn't stay long, but her presence was a quiet treaty, a bridge built between 2 lonely properties. As the sun began to set, casting a warm, golden light over the pines, Dr. Eris stopped by. He gave Shadow a clean bill of health and a new, shiny tag for his collar. He sat with Elias on the porch for a while, the 2 men drinking coffee in comfortable silence as the pie was shared. Sometimes, Dr. Eris said, looking out at the woods. The thing that comes along to save us doesn't look anything like we expect it to." He stood up to leave, placing a gentle hand on Elias's shoulder. "Take care of each other." The quiet of the evening settled around them, a comfortable blanket of peace. Elias ran his hand through Shadow's thick fur, feeling the steady rhythm of the dog's breathing. He hadn't fixed his past, but he was no longer a ghost trapped within it. A man who had lost his purpose and a dog that had lost its place had found a way forward, together. Sometimes, healing doesn't shout. It arrives quietly, on 4 legs, and teaches you how to breathe again.